Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, you're standing at the edge of a Scythian burial mound somewhere on the windswept steppes of Central Asia. The grass bends in waves beneath an impossible sky, and in the distance, felt tents cluster like mushrooms after rain. Smoke rises from a dozen fires, carrying with it a sweet, earthy smell that's older than empires. You're about to trace the thread of a single plant through 5,000 years of human civilization, across continents and cultures, through temples and speakeasies, from sacred ritual to Schedule I narcotic and back again. Good thing this isn't your life, because history has a way of getting complicated when politics, religion, and pleasure all intersect around the same leafy green plant. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this community spans time zones and continents, kind of like the plant we're about to follow tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're crouching inside a felt tent on the Eurasian steppe, somewhere in what will one day be called Kazakhstan, around 500 BCE. The year doesn't matter to you, because calendars haven't been invented in any way you'd recognize. What matters is the cold outside, bone deep, the kind that makes your teeth ache, and the heat inside this tent, radiating from a bronze brazier that sits in the center of the space. 6 warriors crouch around it with you, their leather and wool clothing decorated with gold plaques shaped like stags and griffins. You are Scythian, a nomadic people who've terrified the settled civilizations of Persia and Greece with your mounted archery and your refusal to be conquered. But right now, you're not thinking about conquest. You're thinking about the ceremony that's about to begin. One of the older warriors, his beard braided with bronze beads, lifts a small golden vessel, no bigger than his fist. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Even in the flickering light, you can see that it's been hammered and shaped by a master artisan, decorated with scenes of animals in eternal chase. He places several dried flowers and leaves into the vessel, then sets it directly onto the glowing coals of the brazier. Within seconds, smoke begins to rise, thick, fragrant, unmistakable. It's cannabis, mixed perhaps with opium, and as the smoke fills the enclosed space of the tent, you breathe it in deeply. The felt walls trap everything inside, creating what the Greeks, who will write about your people with equal parts fascination and horror, will describe as a vapor bath. The smoke curls upward, finding the small opening at the tent's peak, but not before saturating the air you breathe. Your head begins to feel light, pleasantly detached from your shoulders. One of the warriors starts to laugh, a deep, genuine sound that seems to come from somewhere beyond himself. Another begins to speak in a low, rhythmic voice, words you recognize as prayers to the sky god who watches over your people. You feel the boundary between your body and the world around you beginning to blur. This isn't recreation, though there's pleasure in it. This is communion, connection, a way of touching something vast and incomprehensible that lives just beyond the edge of ordinary perception. Historians still argue whether the Scythians understood they were getting high, or if they believed the plant itself was divine. The truth probably lives somewhere in between. You know the smoke changes you, makes the world strange and new, opens doors in your mind that are usually closed. Whether that's chemistry or divinity might not be a question that makes sense to you. Perhaps they're the same thing. The Greek historian Herodotus will write about this moment, or moments like it, centuries from now. He'll describe how the Scythians howl with pleasure in their vapor baths, how they use cannabis for purification rituals after funerals, how the smoke is both cleansing and ecstatic. He's writing from outside your culture, trying to make sense of practices that seem exotic and strange to his Greek sensibilities. But he's not making it up. In the 1990s and 2000s, archaeologists will excavate Scythian burial mounds, kurgans, across the Eurasian steppe. Inside the frozen tombs, they'll find exactly what Herodotus described: bronze braziers, small tents, and yes, golden vessels containing the residue of burnt cannabis and opium seeds. One burial mound in particular, called Kurgan II at Pazyryk in Siberia, will yield a leather pouch containing cannabis seeds and a bronze cauldron used for burning the plant. The bodies buried there, presumably important members of your warrior society, went into the afterlife with everything they'd need to continue the ritual on the other side of death. That's how central this plant is to your culture. It's not a vice or an indulgence. It's a technology of transcendence, a bridge between the human and the divine. You lean back, feeling the smoke settle into your lungs, into your blood. Around you, the other warriors are lost in their own experiences. Some quiet and contemplative, others animated, gesturing as they speak to gods or ancestors, or the vast emptiness of the steppe itself. Outside, horses whinny softly. The wind presses against the felt walls, trying to get in. But inside, you're warm and far away, traveling without moving, seeing without opening your eyes. The interesting thing about this moment, the thing that makes it historically significant, beyond just being the earliest well-documented evidence of cannabis inhalation, is what it tells us about human nature. You and your fellow Scythians aren't using this plant because you're bored or because you want to escape hardship, though the steppe in winter is certainly hard enough to escape from. You're using it because humans seem to have an innate drive to alter consciousness, to explore the far territories of the mind, to experience reality from angles that normal waking life doesn't permit. This drive is so strong that it appears in virtually every human culture that has access to psychoactive plants. The Scythians with cannabis, the South Americans with ayahuasca and coca, the Mesoamericans with peyote and psilocybin mushrooms. The impulse is universal, even if the plants vary by geography. The smoke is beginning to thin now, the flowers in the golden vessel reduce to ash. Someone adds more to the brazier, and the cycle begins again. You'll stay in this tent for hours, moving in and out of ordinary consciousness, like a swimmer breaking the surface of water, gasping for air, then diving down again into warm green depths. Outside, the sun is setting over the steppe, painting the grass gold and crimson. Inside, time has become something flexible, negotiable. You are 500 years before the birth of Christ, but you're also timeless, participating in a ritual that will be repeated in different forms with different plants, in different tents and temples and basements and living rooms, for as long as humans walk the earth and wonder what else is possible beyond the narrow frequency of normal awareness. When you finally emerge from the tent, hours or maybe days later, the cold air hits you like a slap. You're back in your body, fully present, the steppe sharp and clear and undeniably real. But something has shifted. You've been somewhere, seen something, touched some edge of understanding that you can't quite articulate now that you're sober. The plant has done its work, and tomorrow or next week, or whenever the next funeral or celebration or moment of seeking occurs, you'll duck back into the felt tent, add more flowers to the brazier, and make the journey again. The Scythians, for all their fearsome reputation, will eventually fade from history. Their empire will crumble, their people absorbed into other cultures, their language lost. But this practice, this ancient technology of smoke and transcendence, will travel across continents and centuries, adapting and evolving, never quite disappearing, always finding new forms and new believers. You are at the beginning of a very long story, though you don't know it yet. You're just a warrior on the steppe, breathing smoke in a felt tent, trying to touch the face of God. You're walking through terraced fields in ancient China, sometime around the 1st century CE, though dating things precisely is difficult when you're living through them rather than studying them from a safe historical distance. The fields stretch up the hillside in geometric patterns, and everywhere you look, tall plants sway in the breeze. Cannabis, though you know it by its Chinese name, ma. These aren't the flowering plants that the Scythians burned in their felt tents. These are hemp, cultivated for fiber, growing as tall as a man and a half, their stalks thick and woody. Your people have been growing this plant for thousands of years, longer than anyone can remember, using it for rope, for textiles, for paper, for food. You're following a physician named Hua Tuo, or at least a physician in his tradition, walking a narrow path between the hemp fields toward a village where someone is sick. The physician carries a leather bag filled with preparations, dried herbs, powdered minerals, needles for acupuncture, and yes, processed cannabis in several forms. Ma ren, hemp seeds, ground into powder. Ma fen, hemp flowers, dried and measured. These are medicines, tools for restoring balance when the body's energies fall out of harmony with each other and with the world. The story that will be told about Hua Tuo, whether it's literally true or metaphorically true, is that he was the first surgeon to use anesthesia for major operations. He would mix powdered cannabis with wine, creating a preparation called mafeisan, the cannabis boiling powder, and give it to patients before cutting into their bodies to remove tumors or repair internal injuries. Surgery was usually a death sentence in the ancient world, not because doctors didn't understand anatomy, but because the pain was so overwhelming that patients would die of shock. Hua Tuo's innovation was to remove the pain from the equation, to create a state where the body could be cut without the consciousness experiencing the cutting. Historians still argue whether Hua Tuo was a real historical figure or a composite of several physicians whose techniques were later attributed to one legendary name. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. But what's not ambiguous is that Chinese physicians were using cannabis medicinally by the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, and that this use was sophisticated, precise, and integrated into a larger philosophical system of medicine that understood the body as a landscape of flowing energies. You reach the village, a cluster of wooden buildings with thatched roofs, chickens scratching in the dirt, smoke rising from cooking fires. The physician is greeted with respect. Someone's grandmother has been in pain for weeks, her joints swollen and hot, her movements slow and careful. You watch as the physician examines her, asks questions, feels her pulse at several points on her wrist. Then he opens his bag and removes a small ceramic jar. Inside is a paste made from hemp seeds, ground fine and mixed with other herbs whose names you don't recognize. He instructs the woman to take a spoonful each morning and evening, mixed with warm wine or water. The plant you're looking at, ma, is more versatile than almost any other crop your culture has domesticated. The seeds are food, pressed for oil, ground into flour. The fibers are textile, rope, paper. The flowers and leaves are medicine. Even the roots, boiled down, are said to have properties that cool fever and reduce swelling. There's a reason Chinese farmers have been cultivating this plant for potentially 10,000 years, making it one of the oldest agricultural crops in human history. It does everything. But here's the quirky part, the detail that doesn't usually make it into serious historical accounts. Chinese medical texts warn repeatedly about the dangers of taking too much cannabis. They describe it as yin in nature, cool, dark, feminine, and warn that excessive use can lead to seeing demons or ghosts. One text describes patients who took too much experiencing communication with spirits, which could be either a medical side effect or a religious experience, depending on your perspective. The line between medicine and mysticism has always been thinner than modern categories want to admit. You walk back through the hemp fields as the sun begins to set. The tall stalks cast long shadows, and in the distance you can hear farmers singing as they work. This plant is so woven into the fabric of Chinese civilization that it's almost invisible, like water to fish, too omnipresent to notice. It's not sacred the way it is for the Scythians, not a doorway to the divine. It's practical, useful, mundane. And yet, in the hands of someone like Hua Tuo, it becomes something else. A tool for rewriting the rules of surgery, for separating consciousness from pain, for making the unbearable bearable. In later centuries, Chinese alchemists will become fascinated with cannabis, particularly with the question of whether it can extend life or even grant immortality. Taoist texts will describe elaborate preparations, hemp seeds mixed with ginseng and pine resin, consumed over years, that are supposed to lighten the body until you can walk on air. Whether anyone actually achieved this is, let's say, uncertain. But the fact that they tried tells you something about how this plant was perceived. Not just as fiber or medicine, but as potential, as possibility, as a bridge between the human and the transcendent. The paper you'll use tomorrow to write a letter, that's hemp. The rope that secures your family's boat to the dock, hemp. The cloth shirt you're wearing, probably hemp, or at least partly. The medicine your grandmother takes for her aching joints, hemp again. It's everywhere, this plant. So common that it barely registers as special. And yet, under the right circumstances, prepared the right way, it becomes a key that unlocks doors in both the body and the mind. You don't think of yourself as living through history. You're just living, walking through hemp fields, watching a physician work, existing in a world where this tall, fibrous plant with its distinctive leaves is as ordinary as rice or millet. But centuries from now, historians will look back at this moment and see the foundations of something vast, a global relationship with cannabis that's both utterly practical and deeply mysterious, both medicine and intoxicant, both rope and revelation. The sun is fully set now. You make your way home through the village, past houses where oil lamps are being lit, where families are gathering for evening meals. Above you, stars are beginning to appear, sharp and bright in the darkening sky. In your pocket, you carry a small package of hemp seeds that the physician gave you, a gift, or maybe payment for accompanying him today. You'll plant them in the small garden behind your house, and by next summer, you'll have a few stalks of your own, tall and green and useful in a dozen different ways. It's a good plant, a reliable plant, a plant that's been with your people so long it might as well be family. And like family, it contains multitudes, practical and magical, ordinary and extraordinary, depending on how you look at it and what you need it to be. The Vedas, the oldest religious texts in Hinduism, composed between 2000 and 1400 BCE, specifically mention cannabis. The Atharva Veda calls it one of the 5 sacred plants, a gift from the gods meant to bring joy, courage, and liberation from anxiety. The text describes it as being brought from the heavens to protect humanity and grant pleasure. That's not metaphor or poetry trying to make something questionable sound respectable. That's doctrine, right there in some of the foundational texts of one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions. Lord Shiva, in particular, is associated with cannabis. The stories vary, but one common version says that Shiva discovered the plant after a family argument, taking shelter under its leaves and feeling immediately refreshed and renewed. Another version says he drank bhang during the churning of the cosmic ocean, when gods and demons work together to extract the nectar of immortality from the sea. In either case, Shiva becomes the lord of bhang, the deity most closely associated with cannabis use, especially among sadhus and yogis who model their lives on his ascetic example. The bhang is starting to work now. You can feel it in the way colours seem slightly brighter, in the way the drum beat seems to sync with your heartbeat, in the way the boundary between your body and the warm afternoon air feels less distinct than it did 20 minutes ago. This is what bhang does. It doesn't hammer you into a different state of consciousness like some intoxicants. It invites you, coaxes you, slowly and gently shifts your perception until you're experiencing reality from a slightly different angle. You're sitting on a silk cushion in northern India, in a temple courtyard open to the sky, sometime around 1000 BCE. Give or take a few centuries, because precision wasn't exactly the priority when the Vedas were being composed. The air smells like sandalwood and marigolds, and the sweet, milky drink in the clay cup you're holding. The drink is bhang, made from cannabis leaves and flowers ground into a paste, mixed with milk, sugar, almonds, and spices. It's part of the festival. You can hear drums in the distance, voices raised in song, the sound of celebration that seems to rise from the earth itself. Bhang is everywhere during festivals. During Holi, the spring celebration where people throw coloured powder at each other and social hierarchies temporarily dissolve into playful chaos. During Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva, when devotees fast and pray and stay awake through the darkness, using bhang to maintain alertness and heighten devotion. It's legal, it's sacred, it's woven so deeply into religious practice that separating cannabis from Hinduism would be like trying to separate bread from Christianity or dates from Islam. They're too entangled to separate cleanly. You take a sip of the bhang. It's sweet and slightly gritty, with a taste that's both pleasant and vaguely earthy. You know it will take a while to work. This isn't smoking, where the effects hit you in minutes. Drinking bhang is a slower process, a gradual opening rather than a sudden door. You settle back against the temple wall and watch the courtyard. A sadhu, a wandering holy man, sits in lotus position near the shrine, his body covered in ash, his hair matted into long dreadlocks. He's drinking bhang too, probably has been for hours or maybe days. For him, this isn't recreation, it's sadhana, spiritual practice, a way of dissolving the ego and experiencing union with the divine. Around the courtyard, other people are drinking bhang too. Old women and young men, families and solitary seekers. People from different castes sitting together in a way they normally wouldn't. Festival times are liminal times, when the ordinary rules relax and something else becomes possible. You watch a group of children playing, their laughter high and bright, and you think about how this plant has been part of this culture for so long that no one alive can remember a time before it. It predates colonialism, predates the Mughal Empire, predates even the codification of Hinduism into anything resembling its modern form. It's ancient, foundational, sacred. Here's the interesting quirk that historians love to point out. India recognizes 3 distinct forms of cannabis, each with its own uses and cultural associations. Bhang, what you're drinking now, is made from the leaves and is considered the mildest, most acceptable form. Ganja, made from the flowering tops of the female plant, is stronger and associated more with sadhus and serious practitioners. And charas, which is hand-rolled hashish, resin collected from living plants, is the strongest of all and carries more ambiguous moral weight. The fact that Indian culture makes these distinctions, treating cannabis as a spectrum rather than a single substance, tells you something about the sophistication and nuance of the relationship. The sun is moving lower in the sky, painting the temple walls orange and pink. The bhang has fully settled into your system now, and everything feels right. The temperature of the air, the sound of the drums, the presence of the other people in the courtyard. You're not disconnected from reality, you're more connected, more present, aware of details you'd normally overlook. The way light filters through leaves, the texture of the silk cushion beneath you. the complexity of flavors still lingering in your mouth. Almond, cardamom, rosewater, the green taste of the cannabis itself. A priest emerges from the temple, carrying a small oil lamp, beginning the evening arti, the ritual of light. He moves the flame in circles before the image of the deity, and you watch the light trace patterns in the gathering darkness. Sacred geometry, the visible manifestation of divine order. Or maybe just fire moving through space, and you're high enough that it seems profound. Historians still argue whether the religious use of cannabis is truly spiritual, or if it's just intoxication dressed up in theological language. But sitting here in this courtyard, watching the lamps circle and circle, feeling the bhang move through your blood, the distinction seems meaningless. The experience is real, whether you call it chemistry or grace. You'll drink bhang again next festival, and the festival after that, and so on through your life, until it becomes simply what you do. As natural as fasting during religious observances, or singing devotional songs, or any of the other practices that mark you as part of this particular culture in this particular moment of history. Your children will drink bhang, your grandchildren, on and on through centuries, until some British colonial administrators arrive and look at this practice with horror and incomprehension, trying to prohibit something that's been sacred for millennia. But that's future trouble. Right now, you're sitting in a temple courtyard as the stars begin to appear, feeling connected to something vast and ancient. And the bhang is exactly what it was always meant to be. A door, slightly ajar, inviting you to peek through and see what's on the other side. You're sitting cross-legged on red earth in southern Africa, sometime around the 15th or 16th century CE, in a village where the houses are arranged in careful circles and the smell of wood smoke hangs permanent in the air. The sun is intense here, almost violent, beating down from a sky that seems too big, too blue. Around you, a dozen other people sit in a circle, elders mostly, men and women whose faces carry the accumulated knowledge of decades. In the center of the circle is a clay pipe, elaborately decorated with carved patterns, about the length of your forearm. It's being passed around, each person taking their turn, inhaling deeply, holding the smoke, then releasing it toward the sky in a long, slow exhale. This is dagga, or more properly, cannabis, though the Khoisan people who gave it the name dagga encountered it long before you did. The plant isn't native to Africa. It arrived through trade routes, brought by Arab merchants and Indian sailors who traveled the coasts, exchanging goods and ideas, and yes, psychoactive plants. But it's been here long enough now that it might as well be indigenous. It's woven into ritual, medicine, social structure. It's how disputes are settled, how treaties are confirmed, how elders commune with the ancestors who watch over the living and judge their choices. The pipe reaches you. You take it carefully. There's etiquette here, protocols that matter. You don't just grab and puff. You receive it with both hands, acknowledging the person who passes it to you. You bring it to your lips, slowly, with intention. The smoke is harsh, harsher than you expected, and it takes discipline not to cough. You hold it in your lungs as long as you can, feeling it burn, feeling your head begin to swim. Then you exhale, watching the smoke rise and dissipate in the bright afternoon air. You pass the pipe to your left, completing the circuit. Cannabis came to Africa through multiple routes and multiple time periods. The earliest physical evidence, pipes containing cannabis residue, dates to 14th century Ethiopia. But oral histories suggest it arrived earlier, spreading south and west through trade networks that connected the interior of the continent to the coasts to Arabia and India to the rest of the world. The Bantu peoples adopted it enthusiastically, incorporating it into their social and religious lives. Among some groups, like the Bashilange people of what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, cannabis use became central to an entire social movement, the Ben Riamba cult, which promoted peace and used communal smoking to resolve conflicts without violence. The pipe continues its slow circuit around the circle. Each time it returns to you, you take another draw. The cannabis is strong, sticky with resin, cultivated specifically for this purpose. This isn't hemp grown for fiber. This is the flowering tops of female plants, carefully tended and harvested. Your head feels light now, detached. The harsh African sun seems less oppressive, filtered through the haze of smoke and altered perception. Someone begins to speak, an elder, his voice low and rhythmic, talking about a dispute between neighboring villages over grazing rights. The words seem to come from very far away, or very deep inside, you're not sure which. Here's something historians point out. African cannabis use tends to be more communal than individual. This circle you're sitting in isn't a bunch of friends getting high for fun. It's a political body, a judicial system, a religious congregation, all rolled into one. The pipe creates temporary equality. While it's being passed, social hierarchies soften. Everyone breathes the same smoke, experiences the same alteration. And in that altered state, people are believed to be more truthful, more receptive to wisdom, more capable of seeing beyond their own narrow self-interest to what benefits the community as a whole. The missionary accounts from the 19th century, written by Europeans who encountered African cannabis culture, with a mixture of fascination and moral horror, describe elaborate rituals around dagga use. Special pipes that were only used for certain occasions. Cultivation techniques that maximize potency. Spiritual beliefs about the plant's ability to facilitate communication with ancestors. The missionaries wanted to stamp it all out, of course, as part of their broader project of converting Africans to Christianity and European cultural norms. But the practice was too deeply rooted, too central to too many aspects of social life. It persisted, adapted, went underground when necessary, but never disappeared. The sun is lower now, the quality of light shifting from harsh white to something softer, golden. You're deeply high, to use terminology from a future you'll never see. The world has taken on a dreamlike quality, vivid but slightly unreal. The elder is still speaking, his words weaving in and out of your comprehension. You catch phrases. The ancestors guide us. What is good for the people? Let wisdom smoke tobacco. No, wait, that's not right. Your translation skills are scrambled. You shake your head slightly, trying to clear it, but the fog remains, pleasant and disorienting. Historians still argue about why cannabis spread so successfully through African cultures. Was it the plant's practical uses as medicine? Its social value in creating ritual space? Its genuine effectiveness in facilitating conflict resolution by making people less aggressive and more contemplative? Probably all of the above, mixing in proportions that varied from place to place, people to people. But whatever the reasons, by the time European colonizers arrived in force in the 19th century, cannabis was established across huge swathes of the continent, known by a dozen different names: dagga, riamba, bhang, jamba, each one pointing to a slightly different local tradition. The pipe makes one final circuit. By the time it reaches you, the bowl is nearly empty, just a few last wisps of smoke clinging to the ashes. You take a final draw anyway, more symbolic than practical, and pass it on. The circle is complete. The elder who was speaking has finished his speech, and now there's a general murmur of conversation as people discuss what was said, what should be done about the grazing dispute, whether the ancestors have made their wishes clear. You're still too high to contribute much, but you nod along, feeling part of something larger than yourself, part of a community bound together by ritual and shared experience. And yes, by this plant that came from somewhere else but has become, over centuries, deeply, authentically yours. As the meeting breaks up and people begin to drift back to their homes, you stand slowly, carefully, making sure your legs will support you. The world spins slightly, then steadies. You look up at the sky. It's that particular shade of blue-purple that only exists for a few minutes at African dusk, the color of deep water or dreams. You think about the smoke you inhaled, where it is now, dispersed into the atmosphere, part of the air everyone breathes. You think about the plant that produced it, growing somewhere in a carefully tended garden, reaching toward the sun, unaware of all the human meaning that's been projected onto it. And you think, though the thought is vague and slightly confused, that there's something beautiful about how humans take the natural world and make it sacred, turning ordinary plants into bridges between the human and the divine, the individual and the community, the present and the past. Then you head home, still slightly high, ready for evening meal and sleep and tomorrow's ordinary tasks, the ritual complete until the next time the pipe is filled and the circle forms again. Here's where history gets muddied by modern politics. There's a persistent myth that the founding fathers grew cannabis for smoking, that they were somehow crypto-stoners who understood the plant's recreational potential. This is almost certainly false. Industrial hemp and drug-type cannabis are the same species, cannabis sativa, but they're bred for completely different purposes, and by the colonial period, they were distinct enough that you couldn't easily convert one to the other. The founders knew hemp as an industrial crop, full stop. The idea that they were secretly getting high is wishful thinking projected backward by people who want historical validation for modern recreational use. But hemp still mattered enormously to the colonial project. You can see it in the laws. Multiple colonies passed legislation requiring hemp cultivation. Some even allowed farmers to pay their taxes in hemp. The Continental Navy during the Revolutionary War was rigged almost entirely with American-grown hemp rope because importing it from Britain was no longer an option after, the whole declaring independence thing. The Declaration of Independence itself was probably drafted on hemp paper, not the final version, which was written on parchment, but the working drafts that Jefferson scribbled and crossed out and revised. You reach the end of a row and pause, wiping sweat from your forehead. In the distance, you can see other workers moving through other rows, their backs bent, their movements slow with exhaustion. Growing hemp is one thing, processing it is worse. The stalks have to be cut, then retted, soaked in water or left in fields to rot until the tough outer fibers separate from the woody core. Then they have to be broken, scutched and combed until you're left with long, usable fibers that can be spun into rope or woven into fabric. It takes weeks of labor to get from growing plant to finished product, and every step is tedious. You're sitting cross-legged on red earth in southern Africa, sometime around the 15th or 16th century CE, in a village where the houses are arranged in careful circles and the smell of wood smoke hangs permanent in the air. The sun is intense here, almost violent, beating down from a sky that seems too big, too blue. Around you, a dozen other people sit in a circle, elders mostly, men and women whose faces carry the accumulated knowledge of decades. In the center of the circle is a clay pipe, elaborately decorated with carved patterns, about the length of your forearm. It's being passed around, each person taking their turn, inhaling deeply, holding the smoke, then releasing it toward the sky in a long, slow exhale. This is dagga, or more properly, cannabis, though the Khoisan people who gave it the name dagga encountered it long before you did. The plant isn't native to Africa. It arrived through trade routes, brought by Arab merchants and Indian sailors who traveled the coasts, exchanging goods and ideas, and yes, psychoactive plants. But it's been here long enough now that it might as well be indigenous. It's woven into ritual, medicine, social structure. It's how disputes are settled, how treaties are confirmed, how elders commune with the ancestors who watch over the living and judge their choices. The pipe reaches you. You take it carefully. There's etiquette here, protocols that matter. You don't just grab and puff. You receive it with both hands, acknowledging the person who passes it to you. You bring it to your lips, slowly, with intention. The smoke is harsh, harsher than you expected, and it takes discipline not to cough. You hold it in your lungs as long as you can, feeling it burn, feeling your head begin to swim. Then you exhale, watching the smoke rise and dissipate in the bright afternoon air. You pass the pipe to your left, completing the circuit. Historians still argue about exactly how much hemp was grown in colonial America. The records are incomplete, biased toward large plantations that kept detailed accounts. Small farmers, enslaved people, women running household economies, their hemp production often went undocumented. But we know it was significant, widespread, and economically important in a way that's hard to overstate. When you read colonial-era documents and they mention cordage or sailcloth or even just cloth, there's a good chance they're talking about hemp products. Here's a quirky detail. Benjamin Franklin owned a paper mill that processed hemp into paper. Cannabis history enthusiasts love to mention this, usually with a knowing wink, as if Franklin was some kind of proto-hippie. But again, context matters. He owned the mill because hemp paper was standard, profitable, and necessary. It wasn't a political statement or a secret signal. It was business. You bend down and examine one of the plants more closely. The stem is fibrous, stringy, exactly what you want for rope making. The leaves are already showing signs of insect damage. Something's been eating them, probably caterpillars. You make a mental note to check the rest of the field tomorrow. Hemp is fairly resistant to pests, but it's not invulnerable. Nothing is. By the mid-19th century, hemp cultivation in America will start to decline. Cotton will prove easier to process, thanks to the cotton gin. Manila hemp from the Philippines will flood the market, offering cheaper alternative fiber. And eventually, synthetic materials will make natural fiber rope obsolete for most purposes. The plant won't disappear. There will be a brief resurgence during World War II, when the government literally ran a campaign called Hemp for Victory, encouraging farmers to grow it for the war effort. But it will fade from its position of central economic importance. Historians still argue about exactly how much hemp was grown in colonial America. The records are incomplete, biased toward large plantations that kept detailed accounts. Small farmers, enslaved people, women running household economies, their hemp production often went undocumented. But we know it was significant, widespread, and economically important in a way that's hard to overstate. When you read colonial-era documents and they mention cordage or sailcloth, or even just cloth, there's a good chance they're talking about hemp products. Here's a quirky detail. Benjamin Franklin owned a paper mill that processed hemp into paper. Cannabis history enthusiasts love to mention this, usually with a knowing wink, as if Franklin was some kind of proto-hippie. But again, context matters. He owned the mill because hemp paper was standard, profitable, and necessary. It wasn't a political statement or a secret signal. It was business. You bend down and examine one of the plants more closely. The stem is fibrous, stringy, exactly what you want for rope making. The leaves are already showing signs of insect damage. Something's been eating them, probably caterpillars. You make a mental note to check the rest of the field tomorrow. Hemp is fairly resistant to pests, but it's not invulnerable. Nothing is. By the mid-19th century, hemp cultivation in America will start to decline. Cotton will prove easier to process thanks to the cotton gin. Manila hemp from the Philippines will flood the market, offering cheaper alternative fiber. And eventually, synthetic materials will make natural fiber rope obsolete for most purposes. The plant won't disappear. There will be a brief resurgence during World War II when the government literally ran a campaign called Hemp for Victory, encouraging farmers to grow it for the war effort. But it will fade from its position of central economic importance. You're descending a narrow staircase in Harlem, sometime in the mid-1920s, and the air gets thicker with each step down. It's evening. The streets above are bustling with the particular energy of New York City after dark. But down here it's a different world entirely. The staircase opens into a basement room, low-ceilinged and dim, lit by a few bare bulbs that cast everything in warm, amber tones. This is a tea pad, though there's no tea being served in any conventional sense. The tea is marijuana, and this room is one of hundreds, maybe 500 at the peak, scattered across Harlem, providing a space where Black Americans can gather, smoke, listen to music, and escape, briefly, from the suffocating racism of Jim Crow America. You pay a small fee at the door, 25 cents, maybe 50, and find a spot on one of the worn couches that line the walls. The room is already full, smoke hanging in the air like fog, sweet and thick and unmistakable. A man in the corner is playing trumpet, the notes sliding and bending in ways that straight-laced European classical music would never permit. Jazz, they're calling it, this new form that emerged from New Orleans and migrated north during the Great Migration, bringing with it not just a sound, but an entire cultural revolution. The trumpet player is improvising, following the chord changes, but adding his own commentary, his own story, and everyone in the room understands implicitly that this is black innovation, black genius, black resistance transformed into art. Someone passes you a joint, that's what they're calling them, though reefer and muggles and Mary Warner are also popular slang terms. The paper is thin, hand-rolled with a practiced efficiency that speaks to experience. You take a hit, hold it, exhale slowly. The high comes on quickly. This is smoking, not eating bhang, not sipping tinctures. Within minutes, your perception shifts. The music sounds richer, more complex, layers of harmony and rhythm that you didn't notice before, suddenly obvious. The conversation around you, fragments about work and family and the rent that's due tomorrow, takes on a philosophical depth. Louis Armstrong smoked marijuana. He wrote about it in letters to friends, called it gauge, and credited it with helping his music, his creativity, his ability to endure the grind of constant touring and performing. Cab Calloway sang about it, The Reefer Man, a playful song that everyone knew was about marijuana, even though it never said so explicitly. Metz Mesro, a white clarinet player who moved to Harlem and immersed himself so deeply in black culture that he claimed to be Negro, became famous as much for dealing high-quality marijuana as for his musicianship. The connection between jazz and cannabis was so strong that they were almost synonymous in the public imagination. But here's the thing, and this is where history gets dark. Marijuana was legal when these tea pads opened. There were no federal laws against it. Some states had restrictions, but enforcement was spotty at best. The tea pads operated semi-openly, advertised by word of mouth, tolerated by police who had bigger concerns during Prohibition. But that tolerance was fragile, built on the assumption that marijuana use was confined to minority communities, black people, Mexican immigrants, some white bohemians and musicians, and therefore not a threat to respectable white society. That assumption wouldn't last. In 1930, Harry Anslinger became the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He needed a mission, a justification for his agency's budget and existence, and he found it in marijuana. The propaganda campaign he launched was openly, explicitly racist. He He claimed marijuana made black men violent and gave them superhuman strength. He said it made white women vulnerable to sexual advances from black men, playing directly into the most vicious racist fears of the era. He collected anecdotes, many of them fabricated or exaggerated, about marijuana-induced violence and madness, and he pushed relentlessly for federal prohibition. The trumpet player finishes his solo, and the room erupts in snaps and murmured appreciation. You don't clap in a teapad. The sound is too sharp, might draw attention from the street. You take another hit and watch smoke curl toward the ceiling, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. This moment, this precise configuration of music and smoke and community is temporary. You don't know it yet, but it's already being dismantled. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 will make cannabis effectively illegal at the federal level, not by banning it outright, but by imposing registration and taxation requirements so onerous that legal compliance becomes impossible. Historians still argue about Anslinger's motivations. Was he a true believer who genuinely thought marijuana was dangerous? Or was he a cynical bureaucrat who weaponized racism to secure funding and power? Probably both, in shifting proportions, depending on the day and the audience. But whatever his internal state, the results were clear. Marijuana prohibition became a tool for controlling and criminalizing black and brown communities, for giving police legal justification to raid homes and arrest people who weren't otherwise breaking any laws. The teapad culture will collapse fast once federal prohibition takes hold. Too risky, too visible, too easy for police to raid. Some will continue as speakeasies did during alcohol prohibition. Underground, secret, accessible only to those who knew someone who knew someone. But many will just close, the owners moving on to safer enterprises, the musicians and patrons finding other spaces or learning to smoke at home, alone, in more isolation and fear. But right now, in this moment, you're still safe, still part of a community, still listening to some of the most innovative music being created anywhere in the world, while smoke curls and conversation flows, and the weight of the outside world feels briefly, blessedly distant. A woman starts singing, no microphone, just her voice filling the room, bluesy and deep, and carrying the weight of every hard thing she's ever lived through. Everyone falls quiet to listen. Even the smoke seems to still, hanging motionless in the air. This is what gets lost in policy debates and medical discussions and modern legalization arguments. The actual lived experience of the people who used cannabis. The cultural context that made it meaningful rather than merely intoxicating. These teapads weren't just places to get high. They were community centers, safe spaces, cultural incubators where jazz evolved and black art flourished, and people could, for a few hours, exist without the constant weight of white supremacy pressing down on them. The Reefer Madness propaganda film will come out in 1936, funded by a church group, picked up and distributed by Anslinger's bureau. It will depict marijuana users as violent, insane, sexually deviant, all coded language for black and Mexican, all designed to terrify white middle-class audiences into supporting prohibition. And it will work. Not because marijuana was actually dangerous, but because racism was already deeply embedded in American culture, and Anslinger gave people permission to direct their racist fears at a specific target. You finish the joint and pass what's left to the next person. Your head is pleasantly fuzzy, your body relaxed into the couch. The trumpet player has started another solo, even more adventurous than the first, pushing the boundaries of what melody can be. You close your eyes and just listen, letting the music wash over you, living in this moment before it disappears, before history turns marijuana from a plant into a political weapon, before the teapads close and the musicians scatter and this particular configuration of culture and community becomes just a memory, preserved in a few photos and recordings and stories, passed down through generations, who wonder what it was really like, whether it was as good as it sounds, whether there was really a time when you could descend a staircase in Harlem and find a room full of smoke and music and temporary freedom. There was. You're in it right now. And it's exactly as good as it sounds, maybe better, though that might just be the reefer talking. You're standing in a government office in Washington, D.C., sometime in 1971, and Richard Nixon is on television. Not in the room with you, you're watching him through a screen, his face filling the frame, his voice carrying that particular combination of authority and barely suppressed anger that defined his presidency. He's declaring drug abuse public enemy number one, announcing a comprehensive plan to fight what he's calling a war on drugs. The metaphor is deliberate, military, designed to mobilize resources and public support the way actual wars do. And the primary target, though he doesn't say it quite this explicitly, is marijuana. You're watching this because it's your job. You work in drug policy, or maybe criminal justice, or maybe social services. Somewhere in the machinery of government where policy gets translated into action. And you're watching Nixon declare war on a plant, on the people who use it, on entire communities that will be targeted and destabilized by what's about to happen. The Controlled Substances Act passed last year in 1970, classifying marijuana as Schedule 1, meaning high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and unsafe even under medical supervision. Never mind that multiple cultures have used it medicinally for thousands of years. Never mind that it's demonstrably less harmful than alcohol, which remains legal and socially acceptable. It's Schedule 1 because Nixon's administration decided it should be, and that decision is about politics, not science. Here's what John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, will admit decades later in a 1994 interview. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That quote won't be published until long after you're dead, probably. But you don't need to read it to understand what's happening. It's obvious if you pay attention to who gets arrested, who gets prosecuted, whose communities get flooded with police, whose children get taken away, whose futures get destroyed by criminal records that follow them forever. Marijuana prohibition isn't about public health. It's about social control. It's about maintaining hierarchies. It's about giving the state legal justification to surveil, arrest, and incarcerate populations it considers dangerous or problematic. The Drug Enforcement Administration will be created in 1973, consolidating various federal drug agencies under one umbrella. It will have enormous funding, enormous power, and a mandate to enforce prohibition aggressively. Arrests for marijuana possession will skyrocket, not because more people are using it, but because enforcement becomes a priority, a metric of success, a way for police departments to generate arrests, and prosecutors to generate convictions, and private prisons to generate profits. By the 1990s and 2000s, hundreds of thousands of people will be arrested annually for marijuana offences. The vast majority for simple possession rather than trafficking or distribution. Historians still argue about whether the drug war was inevitable or if it represented a deliberate political choice. The evidence increasingly points toward deliberate choice. Multiple commissions studied marijuana during the 1970s and recommended decriminalization. The Schaefer Commission, appointed by Nixon himself in 1972, concluded that marijuana posed minimal threat to public health and that criminal penalties were disproportionate and harmful. Nixon ignored the findings. He'd already decided on war, and facts that contradicted that decision were simply obstacles to be ignored or suppressed. You turn off the television. Nixon's speech is over, but its consequences are just beginning. In the years ahead, you'll watch as sentencing laws become increasingly harsh. Mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, asset forfeiture that allows police to seize property from people merely suspected of drug crimes, without conviction, without due process. The drug war will become a machine that consumes lives, families, entire communities, with marijuana arrests serving as the entry point for millions of people into a criminal justice system designed more for punishment than rehabilitation. And here's the really grim part. Racial disparities in enforcement will be staggering. Despite roughly equal rates of marijuana use across racial groups, Black Americans will be arrested at 3 to 4 times the rate of white Americans. In some jurisdictions, the disparity will be even higher, 10 times, 12 times. The drug war will effectively create a new Jim Crow system, a way of maintaining racial hierarchy through mass incarceration instead of explicit segregation laws. You think about the Scythians in their felt tents, the Chinese physicians with their medical texts, the Indian festivals where bhang flows freely. You think about the jazz musicians in Harlem teapads, creating beauty while smoke curled toward the ceiling. And you think about how a plant that's been used for thousands of years across dozens of cultures suddenly became, in the span of a few decades, grounds for arrest, imprisonment, the destruction of futures and families. Not because the plant changed, because politics changed, because fear and racism and the desire for social control found a convenient target. The drug war will last decades. It will cost over $1 trillion. It will result in tens of millions of arrests. It will destabilize entire countries, Mexico, Colombia, Afghanistan, turning them into war zones as cartels battle over black market profits that prohibition creates. And through it all, marijuana use will remain roughly constant. People will keep smoking, keep growing, keep finding ways around the prohibition. Because making something illegal doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it more dangerous, more profitable for criminals, and more likely to result in violence. You gather your papers and prepare to leave the office. Outside, the DC streets are crowded with workers heading home, tourists taking photos of monuments, the normal flow of life in the capital. And somewhere in those crowds, someone is carrying a joint in their pocket, or a small bag of marijuana, or seeds they plan to plant in their backyard. They're risking arrest, criminal record, potentially years in prison, for possessing a plant that humans have used since before recorded history. The absurdity is staggering, but it's also policy now. Law, enforced with guns and prisons, and the full weight of government power. Nixon called it a war. He was right about that much. Wars have casualties, and this one will produce millions, most of them poor, most of them black or brown, most of them guilty of nothing more than possessing a plant that grows wild in ditches across half the world. You head home, thinking about Scythian warriors and Chinese farmers and Indian festivals, wondering what they'd make of this moment, this perverse transformation of medicine and ritual into crime and punishment. Probably they'd laugh, or weep, or smoke something to make the absurdity bearable, which would get them arrested too. You're standing at a dispensary in Colorado, sometime in 2024, and the store looks like an Apple store designed by botanists. Clean white walls, sleek display cases, professional staff wearing name tags and ready to explain the difference between indica and sativa, between THC percentages and terpene profiles. You're here legally, presenting your ID to prove you're over 21, choosing from a menu that lists strains by name and effect: anxiety relief, creative focus, deep sleep. The cultural distance between this moment and that government office where Nixon declared war is almost incomprehensible. Something shifted. Somehow, against all odds and decades of aggressive prohibition, marijuana moved from Schedule I narcotic to legal consumer product in multiple states. The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened through ballot initiatives and legislative battles, through medical marijuana campaigns that emphasized suffering cancer patients and children with seizures rather than recreational users. It happened through changing generational attitudes. Younger Americans who grew up with DARE programs and Just Say No campaigns, and then tried marijuana and realized they'd been lied to about its dangers. It happened through economic calculation, states looking at Colorado and Washington's tax revenues after they legalized recreational use in 2012 and thinking, we could use that money. And it happened through the slow, grinding work of activists and lawyers and families destroyed by prohibition who refused to accept the drug war as permanent or inevitable. As of 2024, 39 states have legalized medical marijuana. 24 have legalized recreational use. Public support for legalization is at 88%, numbers that would have seemed impossible even a decade ago. And yet, and this is crucial, marijuana remains federally illegal. It's still Schedule I. The federal government still classifies it as having no medical value and high potential for abuse, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This creates a bizarre legal patchwork where something can be perfectly legal at the state level and a federal crime simultaneously. You're examining a package of edibles, gummies shaped like fruit, each one containing precisely measured doses of THC. The packaging is childproof, covered in warnings and information about ingredients and potency. This is what marijuana looks like when it emerges from prohibition. Regulated, tested, commodified. Some people see this as progress, evidence that sensible drug policy can eventually prevail over fear and propaganda. Other people see it as capitalism absorbing and monetizing what was previously a form of cultural resistance, turning pot into product, stripping away the communal and countercultural associations that gave it meaning. Historians still argue about what caused the shift toward legalization. Was it changing attitudes about government's role in regulating individual behavior? Was it growing awareness of racial disparities in drug law enforcement? Was it simply generational change? Old prohibitionists dying off and being replaced by people with different experiences and assumptions? Probably all of the above, in proportions that vary depending on which state or community you're examining. But here's what hasn't changed. Racial disparities persist even after legalization. Black Americans are still arrested at higher rates for marijuana offenses in states where it's legal. People with prior convictions for marijuana possession, disproportionately black and brown, often can't get licensed to operate the dispensaries that are now making millions in profit. The drug war's legacy doesn't disappear just because policy changes. It persists in criminal records, in broken families, in communities that lost generations of young men to prisons. You complete your purchase, 1/8 of an ounce of flour, legal, taxed, packaged in a smell-proof container with a label listing cannabinoid percentages and harvest dates. You step back out onto the street and everything looks normal. No police, no fear of arrest. Just another transaction in the legal economy, unremarkable as buying coffee or aspirin. But you can't help thinking about the millions of people who were arrested for doing exactly what you just did. The people still sitting in prison for marijuana offenses that are no longer crimes in their states. The families destroyed and futures denied by a prohibition that has finally started to crumble but hasn't finished falling. The plant itself hasn't changed. Cannabis in 2024 is the same species the Scythians burned in their felt tents, the same plant Chinese farmers harvested for hemp, the same plant that produced the bhang drunk at Indian festivals and the dagga smoked in African ritual circles. What changed is human policy, human law, human willingness to use violence and imprisonment to control what other humans put in their bodies. For 5,000 years, cannabis moved through cultures and across continents, adapting to new contexts, taking on new meanings, but always remaining fundamentally itself. A plant with psychoactive properties that humans found useful or pleasurable or sacred. And now it's in transition again, moving from prohibition back toward acceptance, though the movement is uneven, contested, far from complete. Some states still enforce harsh criminal penalties. The federal government still maintains prohibition. International treaties still classify marijuana as a dangerous drug. But the trend line is clear. Whether through state-level legalization, federal decriminalization, or eventually full legalization and expungement of past convictions, marijuana is coming out of the shadows, moving from counterculture to mainstream, from Schedule 1 to store shelf. You walk home with your legal purchase, past coffee shops and bookstores, and other people going about their normal lives. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seem almost too vivid to be real. You think about the Scythian warriors howling in their felt tents, about Hua Tuo performing surgery with cannabis anesthesia, about devotees drinking bhang at Shiva festivals, about African elders passing the pipe in ceremonial circles, about colonial farmers harvesting hemp in Virginia fields, about jazz musicians improvising in Harlem teapads, about Nixon declaring war, about all the accumulated history that brought this plant to this moment. And you realize that the story isn't over. It's still being written, still contested, still evolving. The plant remains constant. It's humans who keep changing, keep rewriting the rules, keep deciding what this plant means and whether it's medicine or intoxicant or sacrament or commodity or crime. Somewhere tonight, someone is being arrested for marijuana possession. Somewhere else, someone is buying it legally from a dispensary. In another place, it's being used in religious ritual. In another, it's being studied in a medical laboratory. The Scythians are long gone, their felt tents collapsed, their golden vessels scattered across museum collections. But the plant they burned remains, adaptable and persistent, surviving prohibition and propaganda and 5,000 years of human projection, still growing, still flowering, still waiting to see what story humans will tell about it next. The dispensary lights are dimming in your mind now, and the streets outside are growing quieter, softer, as evening settles into night. You're back in your own space, your own time. The journey through 5 millennia of smoke and policy and human relationship with a single persistent plant finally coming to rest. Think about those Scythian warriors one more time, crouched in their felt tent, breathing sacred vapors under an endless sky, completely unaware that thousands of years later, people would still be arguing about whether this plant is medicine or menace, sacrament or sin. The plant itself never cared about those categories, never needed our permission or our prohibition. It just grew, season after season, continent after continent, adapting to new climates and new human stories, patient in a way that only plants can be. History moves in strange circles. What begins as sacred ritual becomes colonial commodity, becomes medical treatment, becomes criminal contraband, becomes legal product. And maybe, eventually, finds its way back to something like the beginning. A plant that humans use, for reasons as varied as humans themselves, without the weight of war or imprisonment, making every choice a potential catastrophe. We're not there yet, not quite, but the direction seems clear, even if the path remains uncertain. Somewhere tonight, seeds are being planted that will grow into plants that will flower next summer. Somewhere, someone is sharing a joint with friends, laughing about nothing in particular, living through a moment that won't make it into history books, but matters anyway because it's theirs. And somewhere, probably, someone is still in prison for doing what's now legal in half the states, waiting for a justice that's taking too long to arrive.
But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, you can rest. You've traveled far through steppes and rice fields, through temple courtyards and colonial farms, through jazz clubs and government offices and modern dispensaries. And the journey has earned you this soft landing into sleep. The plant will still be there tomorrow, doing what it's always done, growing toward light, flowering in season, completely indifferent to whether humans call it sacred or criminal or anything in between. Let that thought settle you. Let history fade into background. Let your breathing slow and deepen. The story continues, but your part in tonight's telling is complete. The felt tent is collapsing softly around you. The smoke is clearing. The music from the teapad is fading to silence. And you're drifting now, easy and gentle, into whatever dreams come next. While somewhere far away, the wind moves through a field of tall green plants that have been here longer than empires and will be here long after tonight's arguments are forgotten. Sleep well. The plants are patient. Morning will come soon enough.